The problem is pediatricians don't really look inside babies or toddlers' mouths. If there's a cold, they might do a quick look to see if there's redness in the back of the throat or do a little throat culture test. But this is why it seems that so many tongue and lip ties, a tongue tie or a lip tie, that they're overlooked because no one really looks inside their mouth. And even a lot of speech pathologists don't. You have to get special permission if you're in a school program to look inside their mouth. As a private practitioner, I did. Parents were always looking through the one-way mirror, but it's very important to look inside there and see what's going on and don't assume all is well.
Hello, and welcome to Talking Toddlers, where I share more than just tips and tricks on how to reduce tantrums or build your toddler's vocabulary. We're going to cover all of that, but here, our goal is to develop clarity, because in this modern world, it's truly overwhelming. This podcast is about empowering moms to know the difference between fact and fiction, to never give up, to tap into everyday activities so your child stays on track. He's not falling behind, he's thriving through your guidance. We know that true learning starts at home, so let's get started.
Hello, and welcome back to Talking Toddlers. I'm Erin Heyer, your host, and this week's episode will help take the guesswork out of common toddler behaviors around teething and drooling. And it sort of piggybacks on a couple of previous episodes where I discussed pacifier use and how to wean your baby and how to deal with that fussiness during those first 12, 16, 18 months. But the goal is always to increase your confidence while you support your baby through these very, very specific stages. And then overall, it brings more ease and a sense of calmness or contentment to your baby, your toddler, and your home life. A friend of mine, a colleague of mine, years and years ago, Suzanne Evans Morris, wrote a great book that was titled Pre-Feeding Skills. And in it, she's pretty well quoted in saying that the mouth and the hand have the most sensory receptors per square inch in the whole human body. And what that means is that your baby's exploration of this world depends on her ability to develop, process, and organize all of the sensory systems in her body. So we as humans are pre-wired to use our hands and our mouth together for exploration, learning, feeding, speech, and so much more. So it starts with understanding what are good mouth experiences and how can we, as parents, new parents especially, but grandparents or primary caretakers, how can we support your baby and your toddler's mouth as her window into this world? Because we know that so many developmental things are going on at the same time, how do we understand how the pieces fit together? So I always have shared with parents, think of mouthing as a means to both explore and learn and calm. And so if you go back to previous episodes, number 63 and 64, I talk a lot about the channel in which your baby can self-soothe and self-calm. So go back and listen or watch those episodes. It's called Fussy Baby, Pacifiers, and Weaning. And part of it was introducing chewing toys that are designed just for that. And when it comes to drooling and teething, they go hand in hand, no pun intended. But right around that third month, that's an excellent time to introduce these chewing toys, even though she or he, your baby, might be using a pacifier. We piggyback the chewing toys to help get them ready for weaning for the pacifier later on around 5, 6, 7 months of age. And that's a process. It'll go all the way until 12, 14, 16 months of age. But go back and take a listen or watch those episodes for more detail as it really centers around fussiness, pacifier use, and then how do I make a plan for weaning them once they're through this developmental stage, somewhere around 12, 14, 16 months. But taking a look at what are mouthing or chewing toys, and there's a whole bunch on the market right there, and there are good ones and better ones, and I will have several of my favorites in the description down below, so you can just look at different varieties for different reasons, but they have to be large enough so your baby doesn't choke on them, right? They have to be small enough that they can bite in all areas of their mouth, in the front, in the middle, so we want it to go back inside their mouth, and in the back, so they would bite it on the side too. And of course, make sure you read the packaging, because safe materials for your baby to mouth and gnaw on all day, every day are pretty important. And as I said, I'll have a few of my favorites in the description below. But today's episode, I really want to focus on this developmental phase of what is drooling and how does that help or hinder teething. And so it's very similar, as I said, to the pacifier, but I do believe that there's a lot of confusion or a lot of misunderstanding around teething and drooling as well as pacifier. But at this point, I always like to make this caveat here that the information I share on these channels are educational purposes and to help you parents decipher through all this kind of noise and all of these conflicting opinions, that if you're ever concerned about your child's health or mental well-being or a very, very specific developmental milestone that they may not be hitting, please contact your family's healthcare provider. It's always best to check in with your family doctor. Meanwhile, continue to listen and watch these episodes, because it will empower you with more specific information that you can then bring specific questions to your healthcare provider and hopefully have a discussion. And that's key. And I have always said to all of my families that I've ever worked with for 35 years that if you feel like you aren't being heard by your healthcare provider, or if you can't have a discussion, I know that, they have these blocks of windows, 10, 12, 15 minutes. But if you go in there armed with information and specific questions and data points, then perhaps they can address them more efficiently with you. So today's focus is to look at the timeline of these developmental stages or necessary developmental markers. What are the expectations? Let me walk you through them. In preparing for this episode, I realized that I needed a graph or a list of these ages and stages, right? So I did go back to the packet that I mentioned in a couple of previous episodes and added this to my packet. The packet is a guide to soothe your baby and your toddler. And I added this information just so you could have the developmental ages and what to look for and what you can do if it's not happening. Just click on it in the description below and sign up for my email list. And then you'll have this informative guide and you'll have the opportunities to look at other packets that I've generated too. But this material for today is things that I've collected over my practice for 35 years, and that I look at a lot of different resources, other highly specialized speech and language pathologists, occupational therapists, ENTs, ear, nose, and throat doctors, dentists and orthodontists that really focus on pediatrics, right? And then a whole field in chiropractor that really specialize in pre-birth, birth, and post-birth with helping them align and get in touch with their bodies and build that self-regulating system. So the key issue that I have found with most parents or lay people that work with this population but aren't aware of oral motor development, we assume that drooling, a lot of drooling, is just normal. But the truth is, a lot of drooling is not typical. And so there are peaks and valleys, and today that's what we're going to talk about, because there are periods where drooling is increased, and then there are periods when it stops altogether or it is significantly reduced. And you need to see progress over time, like all developmental areas, right? That they shouldn't be constantly drooling and constantly dealing with that wet mess all of the time. Some kids, I would see them at 3 or 4 and they're still significantly drooling, and that's not typical or healthy. So the most challenging part is really learning how to differentiate what is normal, expected amount of drooling, and then what is too much. And we'll talk about that as I work through these steps. So think about your 2 to 4 month old, that there will be some drooling when they are mouthing things. And I think most of us understand that they will mouth things. The key is for parents to be comfortable with that and to understand that is their primary mode of learning right now, besides their auditory canal, in understanding how they interface with things and people in this world. But that 2 to 4 month period is really where you'll see the drooling start to appear. Prior to that, there's typically not that much drooling going on. Because they haven't really attached their cognitive awareness of their hand. But 2, 3, 4 months, they have enough stability and enough motor planning that they can reach and grab things and bring it to their mouth with intention. And then somewhere between that 3rd and 6th month, you'll see some drooling with both mouthing and teething, because that's the window where teeth are starting to erupt. And there's a window. Think of the bell curve, where we're going to talk about 75-80% of the average babies out there. And you're going to have outliers, right? That there, in extreme cases, a baby has been born with a tooth already. That's pretty extreme. We don't want to see them too delayed, and we'll talk about that. But between that 3rd and 6th month, the teeth will start to erupt, and usually around 5 or 6 months, that's typically when you start to really see the teeth. And that's when they really need to get a lot of biting and chewing practice to help those teeth push through. And lo and behold, that's also an ideal time to have your baby be introduced to solid foods. And again, it's an introduction period, since they have good stability in their body and they have better control to reach and grab things and bring them to their mouth. The idea now over the next several months is to differentiate what's food and eatable stuff and what's just toys and playing stuff. As those teeth start to begin to appear 5 or 6 months, that's when you can really step in and make sure they're getting a lot of chewing, biting practice, right? And so then between 5 and 9 months, you'll see some drooling. And again, we'll talk a little bit what's the difference between some drooling and a lot of drooling. But this will happen if your baby is on his back, on the belly, sitting up and babbling and talking with you, making a lot of oral motor patterns and sounds, using his hands during feeding. And certain foods will elicit more of a drool, right? Trigger that salivary gland. But the key is, and here's the most important, that it's some drooling. And that's important, because what happens cognitively and what's happening neurologically with them is that they're involved in these activities, right? They're active, both gross motor and fine motor, whether it's hands or their mouth, right? They're eating or talking or playing, right? And the gross motor, whether they're on their belly or they're on their back or they're sitting up in the high chair. And so your baby is learning how to integrate all of these things and synchronize gross motor, fine motor movements. None of these movements or these patterns are automatic or smooth or graceful yet, right? It's still pretty like impulsive almost and jerky, but you'll see the smoothness improve over time. The reason why you'll see some drooling happening is because they can't synchronize or smoothly integrate all of this pattern. So even though most of our swallow is a reflex, right? That we have a sensation back there. Oh, I have saliva in my mouth. I better swallow it. We don't always think about it. And so when your baby's just beginning to integrate or synchronize fine and gross motor skills, then the saliva takes a back seat, right? And so what I really want to highlight today is that there is this rhythm of maturation, of being able to fluidly do whatever activity I am doing, right? Playing or eating, and manage my saliva at the same time. So what's a little or some drooling versus a lot? A lot of drooling means that the shirt is always wet, or that there's so much drooling that he gets a rash on his chin. That is not typical, or that is not some drooling. And in a few minutes, I'll cover what are the time periods, right? And it really does sync up with teething, but it also syncs up with where they are developmentally with biting and chewing and swallowing and speech. So, and we'll talk about how that framework fits together. But it's important for you, mom, dad, grandparents, primary caretaker, to be able to gauge what is too much from what is just some. And it's important between 5 and 9 months of age. So perhaps he's still using the pacifier, which is fine, but you've been introducing these chew toys to him, and you've introduced solid foods to him in this developmental stage. And or you're hoping that teeth are beginning to cut through. So it's all happening together, right? And the idea when you go looking at pacifier and weaning them is as you introduce the chew toys, then you slowly but surely wean away the pacifier, because they get two different sensory perceptions or feedback to a sucking pattern, which is back and forth, right? And a biting pattern. Both are calming and both are important in this developmental stage, but as you're hitting 5, 6, 7, 8 months, that sucking pattern needs to be weaning away. So between 5 and 9 months, there's a lot of teeth cutting going on, and there is a sequential pattern to that as well. So typically you'll see the 2 bottom central incisors pop up, right? And they usually come in pair, not in total sync, but they usually come in pairs. And then you'll see the 2 bottom central incisors, right? The top ones usually starts at the bottom and then go to the top. And then you'll see the 2 lateral incisors, right? And again, they typically come in pairs. And then you'll see the 2 lateral top incisors, right? And this all happens, it starts around 4, 5, 6 months of age. And then these 4 sets of teeth, top and bottom, will come in around 10 months, 12 months. So by their first birthday, you should ideally, right? And this, I think of the bell curve again, the vast majority of kids, if they're progressing right along, then you'll see all of these things coming together. Lo and behold, that's the same time that he's really stepping into the solid food. He's still getting a lot of his nutrients from breastfeeding or bottle feeding, but this is why you have to have a plan. This is why these very important critical steps need to be thoughtful and planned. Okay, so here's the interesting part is that the months span can vary quite a lot, but the sequence typically needs to be consistent. And if it's not, then you need to start looking inside his mouth and figuring out why, and look at his oral mouth play and exploration and all of that, and see what can we do to help support that and get him back on track. And as I said, these 4 sets of teeth and the molars, the first molars will start to come in and might not finish until 16 or 18 months. And that's okay. But the sequence, you don't want teeth coming in arbitrarily. And so that's important to take a look at. Now that those first pair have erupted somewhere between 9 and 12 months, and you have the central and the lateral incisors, there should be no drooling with movements that they've already mastered, such as rolling around or crawling or sitting. And so that's important. This is one of those important markers where you say, okay, now that the teeth are in, and we'll talk about what's that window look like, and he's using gross motor skills to get around in his environment, you shouldn't be seeing drooling. And that's important. So you take a look and say, okay, where are his skills with gross motor, right? Rolling around, crawling, scooting, pulling up to stand and that kind of stuff. And then if all of his teeth are in, why is he still drooling, right? So up to this point, there's a lot of practice with all of these gross motor and fine motor skills. And that's another reason to push tummy time, to push pre-crawling, to get on the floor and practice crawling with them. Because the more that they can wire their body and their mind, their brain, their neurological pathways together, then the more fluid all of that becomes. And then they can focus on those fine motor skills of biting, chewing, swallowing, and speech. So all of this, the tummy time, the crawling, strengthens their torso, as we've discussed before, their back, the neck muscles, the shoulders, the arms, the hands, right, with pushing up on tummy time, the hips and the legs, getting higher and higher up on their chest and their belly. And then once they're on their hips, they're ready to, go to that plank position, right? This all leads to stability and disassociation. And we've talked about how that's important, where you have to have a stable trunk. This is why, it's 4, 5, 6, mostly 5 and 6 months, where they're stable enough to hold their head up and sit in their high chair and safely reach and grab to start to be introduced to foods, to solid foods, right? But that support for breath support, for speech production. So now I can sit and be stable, my shoulders and my neck. And now I can move different parts of my mouth to get different sounds. And the jaw and the lips and the tongue can move separate from one another. And that's the same developmental pattern with eating. And so all of these things work in this beautiful synchronized developmental path. It's not always, on exactly 4.5 months, he's going to do X, Y, Z, but we have a range of a couple of months, but we don't have a range of 6 months. And we have a range of when they start and when they finish, but we don't necessarily have this arbitrary a little bit here and a little bit there. That's the important part. So then toward the end of his first year, 9 to 12 months, some drooling will appear while teething, especially when the bottom first molars start to cut through. But there won't be any drooling with previous learned movements like crawling and walking. If by his first birthday, he's a pretty good walker, give or take, right? We're looking at 12, 14, 16 months. And if the molars have already popped through, and some of these can pop on the early end of this developmental window because you've been giving them a lot of oral motor play, right? And then later on, between 12 and 15 months, the top 2 molars will begin to erupt through the skin. And I'll talk about ways that you can test it out and help them, right? So here's a rule of thumb when the teeth will erupt and how long it takes. And then you can gauge both discomfort and or pain, right? Babies have different thresholds of what is pain or discomfort, but also when that drooling will peak and then when it will subside. So overall, it takes about a week for a tooth to erupt through the gum line. And it's pretty measurable in the sense that if you feel that the teeth are coming in, that's a really good time to up the ante with those biting and chewing toys and give them a little bit more chewable food, right? And there's some people out there online, and I'm sure some doctors say, oh, it's so uncomfortable, give them soft foods. No, what you want is you want them to work that through the gum line, so because then it will erupt more efficiently. Think of all of this talking and playing and chewing and all of this really help massage it. And that window, there'll be a few days in the beginning. So that's when you'll see the drooling increase. And then you'll maybe see they might be a little cranky. And then usually it takes a whole day for the tooth to actually erupt through the skin. And then there's a couple of days after where the gums are healing and everybody's getting, acclimated. So there's about a window, a few days of more drooling and pain, 1 day of eruption, and a couple of days of kind of recovering. And what that typically means is the drooling comes into play, you may or may not be aware of this, to soften the gums, right? And so part of it is your body is producing more saliva on purpose to soften the gums. And then he's at this developmental phase where, he can't handle it all. And it's difficult to swallow all of this all the time. And so it falls forward, right? And so if you notice your little guy or a little gal is beginning to drool more, then the best way is to check inside its mouth, to take a look and to take a feel. And I'll walk through a couple of strategies to use that. Play the tickle game, right? Where they're on the bed and you can look inside their mouth, or literally turn, kids like to be turned upside down. So flip them over and see if you can take a peek. Shine a light in each other's mouth in front of a mirror, cheek to cheek, right? And I have always used in my private practice and then recommend to parents all the time to get a couple of pen lights. You just Google it and at Amazon. Kids love to play with them, but it's a great way to shine in your mouth and his mouth, sit in front of the mirror, or play some funny games and really feel. You also need to very carefully with a clean finger, go in there and feel and see if you can feel the bumps, right? Or if the teeth are breaking through. And hopefully up to this point that you've been checking in his mouth anyways, and hopefully gentle wiping down after breastfeeding or bottle feeding, maybe even brushing his gums with a little gauze, helping set the stage for, teeth brushing once they erupt. This also helps desensitize their whole oral motor cavity. And then you can gauge where they are with their sensitivity, right? And I've shared with you in other episodes where that gag reflex is maturing and moving further and further inside their mouth when they're first born, and when you guys, the first couple of weeks, are getting used to this whole breastfeeding or bottle feeding, the gag reflex was at the tip of the tongue, and it was pretty easy. And that is by design to help babies latch on pretty easily. But now you want to see them, especially 5, 6, 7, 8 months, start to recede that gag reflex to the second half of the mouth or the tongue. And the reason being is now you're putting food in the mouth and he's starting to bite and chew it. But if their gag reflex hasn't migrated back, then that's when kids will gag and spit food out and all of that kind of stuff. So the best answer to that is chew toys. And if you look on the links that I share with you, you'll see that they'll be big enough to really put in their mouth. And that's important, which is very different than the pacifier that is just designed to suck and just designed to push that tongue forward and backward. So the gag reflex and its maturation is very, very important in that second half of that first year too. And a dear friend of mine years and years and years ago, who's a dentist and had 6 children. He was a nice Italian Catholic young man at the time. He's now a grandfather, but he always suggested that parents sit on the bed and then have the toddler put their head on their lap so you can see inside their mouth much easier. It's so hard to get on your knees and, or to sit the baby up. Sometimes if they're compliant and they can stand on the bathroom vanity, but that can be dangerous, right? The bathroom is the most dangerous room in the house with all the hard surfaces, right? But it also acclimates the child to leaning back and opening the mouth and having the dentist look inside their mouth once you decide to go get their first teeth check. Then the children get used to opening wide, shining a light. You can even take it and, pull the cheek to the side so you can see in the back, do it to each other. And it really helps the child feel more at ease with, okay, what's happening inside my mouth? If you haven't been doing this and you have a 2-year-old, then just start to introduce it little by little. Again, in front of the mirror with a little pen light and checking each other. But the problem is pediatricians don't really look inside babies or toddlers' mouths. If there's a cold, they might do a quick look to see if there's redness in the back of the throat or do a little throat culture test. But this is why it seems that so many tongue and lip ties, when a tongue tie or a lip tie, that they're overlooked because no one really looks inside their mouth. And even a lot of speech pathologists don't. You have to get special permission if you're in a school program to look inside their mouth. As a private practitioner, I did. And parents, again, were always looking through the one-way mirror. But it's very important to look inside there and see what's going on and don't assume all is well just because they look like they're growing and developing. And that's a hard gauge, right? Also, remember, please subscribe to be notified when critical topics and guests. And so I have a guest schedule for the next quarter with a dentist who's talking about tongue ties and lip ties. And if you're subscribed, then you'll make sure that you won't miss any of those episodes. And, my goal is to really bring the latest and the best research and the newest and most successful tips and tricks for you to be successful and for your toddler to thrive. So you could also look, as I said, side by side in front of the mirror with your mouth open. But it was interesting that someone on my Instagram posted a question about learning to take turns. And I responded to say, that's a great way to introduce turn taking, especially to an 18, 24, 30-month-old who are still working out this whole turn taking, but to go in front of the mirror and share with a pen light, or I'm going to make a face and then you make a face, or I'm going to check after I brush my teeth and then you get to check after you brush your teeth. So it's a nice non-threatening way to take turns. Who's going to go first? And then you do what I do kind of thing. you can think along those lines as you're building some of these daily habits and these daily routines. That can be very helpful. And then go ahead and think about the pen light, because that can also be helpful, right? But always with your babies and your toddlers, keep it lighthearted. Start to weave these new strategies into your evening routine, and then they'll become acclimated to it, right? And we all want to practice good oral hygiene. So now I want to talk about 4 very specific tips that help when they're in this phase, when you see some drooling happening, you know that the teeth are coming in. How can I support this and really mitigate the pain and the discomfort and really nurture Mother Nature, right? So the drooling is to soften the gums and help the teeth erupt. The biting and the chewing is a very natural calming reflex, right? So it's going to help them kind of chill out and relax more, help them get more focused. So how can we enhance that or take advantage of that? And then I'll talk about when we differentiate what are more serious signs or symptoms, right? When do you have to maybe do something differently, or perhaps call someone, right? So the 4 tips that will help when your child is in this state of teeth eruption and drooling is, like I've been talking about. Number 1 is always these teething toys. That makes a world of difference. And remember, there's a link below of some of my favorites. Number 2 is very similar to what I've always been talking about, playful activities, right? That you can build distractions during the day and keep them busy. Singing and motor planning movements, all those nursery rhymes that have gestures, right? The wheels on the bus go round and round, or it's an itsy bitsy spider, or ring around the rosy. All of those things that have motor, gross motor and fine motor, speech, right? And you're building that. And I always say to parents to really slow it down, because you're building the auditory language processing. You're building, encouraging him to sing along, right? And then you can pause. You can take a swallow of your saliva and show them how it's done. And then you're also building the neural networks to do fine motor, gestures, or even, head, shoulder, knees, and toes. And if they're not sure, if they're not going to a daycare or a preschool, then you do the hand over hand with them. And all of this every day, kind of playful practice, helps build these networks so they get in sync together. And that's the important part, right? But you can also distract them by reading books, going outside, my favorite thing, right? But that distraction and oral speech and practice singing and all of those nursery rhymes, that will really, really help during the day of that 5-day or week-long eruption period, right? The 3rd tip is, so you have your biting or chewing toys, you have your distraction, singing and playing activities, and then you have the good old-fashioned rub the gums, and that really, really helps. Just a couple of minutes, nice circular motion. I have never been an advocate of using a cream, and I think a lot of pediatricians discourage that. I asked a couple of dentists, and they're like, no, just let your finger do the work, right? If you've been exploring in his mouth already, then this shouldn't be a big deal. And it's sort of like you can just say, oh, it's sort of like if you have a boo-boo, mama rubs it, so I'm just going to rub it. And he can, rub your teeth too. Again, learn how to take turns. You do mama first, and then I'll help you, right? But the mirror work, as I mentioned earlier, showing them, oh yeah, a tooth is coming in. You're such a big boy. You're such a big girl. Again, pulling them into the whole mix. You're teaching them what's going on. You're getting them engaged and being an active, child, right? An active participant in this growth process. But as always, ask your doctor if you want to use any over-the-counter stuff. As I said, my professional opinion, it doesn't work. The manual stuff, chewing, rubbing, works a lot better. And then the fourth one, you can chew and bite toys. And then here's some other chew or biting alternatives. I'm sure many of you have seen the mesh sacks that you can put ice chips in. They don't suggest that you actually freeze the teethers, but that you just really cool them. And what I've suggested to families over the years was to put it in a bowl full of ice water, and it gets really, really cold, right? It only takes a couple of minutes to cold up that much. One that we used in our family was to get a baby washcloth and get it wet, and then you put that in the freezer. That's something pretty safe and pretty soothing for the baby then to chew on. Also, baby toothbrushes are a great thing. Again, getting them acclimated to what a toothbrush is. The bristles are pretty soft and the baby can really gnaw on it. Again, giving them a lot of feedback to calm down, but also helping encourage the teeth to come through and push through the gums, right? A good old-fashioned one is to chill a spoon. And I remember my mom telling me about this. So, of course, we tried that numerous times. Then you can also make do-it-yourself frozen popsicles. I recommend that you do it yourself. Then you know the exact ingredients. I also recommend to all of my families that they make it tart, so lemon or lime, not sweet. That the sugar doesn't really help them. But even if you want to, smush up some blueberries or strawberries and then put a couple of drops of lemon or lime in, it makes it a little tartar. And we're building the sensory awareness in their mouth too at the same time. And as I'm talking about this, my mouth is salivating, right? But frozen or very cold foods, some people like bananas or apples. I always used cucumbers. Again, I would put a couple of drops of lemon on it. I think lemon on cucumbers, sliced cucumbers are awesome. But you have to judge where they are in their eating journey, right? If they're 5, 6, 7 months and they're just getting used to it, then using the mesh might be helpful. Some kids really like crusty bread to kind of gnaw and gum on. It gets wet, but if it's not crunchy where it falls apart in your hand, but it's pretty still meaty, some of that crust that you have to rip off with your teeth, right? And then the good old fashioned meat bones are great to gnaw on too. They're not cold, so there is giving a different sensation. But if you remove all of the meat and make sure there's no slices of low bones or something, but a chicken bone or a steak bone, again, babies really, really like chewing on that stuff. So focus in on the eating and chewing. Where are they on that journey? A lot of speech and vocal play with some gestures and motor distractions, but it also helps that wiring of the brain. So they're going to have and develop that mature window or mature swallow pattern much quickly and with ease, right? The idea is that when they are teething, you'll see the drooling spike and there's discomfort for about a week long, and then it should dissipate, right? And so that's the key, is that you're going to see it peak and valley. So I know the big question is always, well, what's too much drooling? And so like I've shared before, if you have chronic wet shirt or you have a rash around the chin, that is not typical. And so that could be telling you that symptom is, I need more gum stimulation. And so what I do want to isolate here today are two different types that may then cause you to pick up the phone and call somebody, right? So there are medical problems, and then there are developmental problems. So the medical is the whole teething and drooling are isolated, right? But if you have congestion or they have a cough, or they have significant sleep disturbance, runny poops, right? A rash on his bum, or true disinterest in eating. So typically, if your child is just teething, they're okay with eating for the most part. They might be eating a little less just because they're uncomfortable and they can't sit up or focus as much, but they're still interested in eating. And if there's a fever or vomiting, all of those signs means that you have a sick child, and it has nothing to do with teething, right? And so make sure that that's when you call your healthcare provider. The other area to look at is when it could be suggesting some oral motor or developmental delays or problems. If the teeth aren't coming in at all, or if the sequence isn't quite as smooth. The windows could be elongated, right? But you still want 2 of the central incisors in the bottom, 2 of the central incisors on the top, and then the lateral incisors, bottom and top. And then a few months later, then you'll get those first molars. And that sequence is very, very typical. And so if that's happening, then you need to look at, okay, what's he doing with his mouth, right? Is he getting a lot of oral motor stimulation? Is he mouthing a lot of things and really, really biting on things? Are you giving him too much pureed food still? Is he getting a great opportunity to chew a wide variety of textures and flavors, right? And then really hone in on some of those oral motor play that can help put him back on track. And as your little guy or your little gal really gain more control of the whole body movements, again, we're going to look at tummy time and pre-crawling and crawling and his stability to sit up, right? And to move from a crawling position to sitting up to rolling over. All of this physical play meant. And you'll see less and less drooling as he's mastering these gross motor skills. And that's important too. And so in the beginning, you'll see some drooling because, like I said, that's going to take a back seat because he's trying to figure out how to crawl. But as crawling is mastered, and he's a pretty mobile kid now, and your life is turned upside down, then the drooling should only be present when the teeth are coming in. And then when they're doing more advanced finger or fine motor tasks, like the finger games that we were talking about, or trying to color, or even speech, that fine motor, then they might be drooling during the teething too. So, look at it and look at these different sections of fine motor and gross motor, and what is he really trying to do, and where is he in that developmental hierarchy as well. So then the final section that I really want to be clear on about too much drooling is that you have to look at the other areas. We talked about what looks like a sick child, and you better call your family doctor, but you also want to look at because this is what you want, right? You want clear sinuses and easy nasal breathing. And I talked about that back in episode 56. And I think it was titled Strong Possibility of Why Toddlers Are Grumpy and How to Address It. So you want good nasal breathing, right? And clear sinuses. You want a good sensory perception in the mouth, right? Can you brush his mouth or clean his gums off? Does he have a hypergag reflex? Is he stuffing his mouth, right? And you also want, and this is one of the first things that I notice when a new client would walk in my office door, is your child's mouth at rest, is it closed? And so that would then lead back to good nasal breathing. If at rest, they're just sitting there with their good jaw alignment, good jaw height, comfortable lip closure, and the tongue is resting up against the hard palate. Again, look back at pacifiers, and we want to make sure that the pacifier isn't in their mouth all day, every day. That the pacifier is used to calm your very, very fussy baby and help transition to sleep only. And that's a hard one. So go back and listen to that episode if you haven't already. And then the other thing to look at, what you want is you want to see your child swallowing spontaneously every 30 seconds. And the stat that I've always shared with families for 35 years is we swallow about 2,000 times a day, 5 pounds of pressure every time we push our tongue appropriately against our hard palate, shaping the roof of our mouth and spontaneously swallowing in a nanosecond, right? What you don't want to see is you don't want to see a stuffy nose with chronic mouth breathing. You don't want sensitivity in their mouth or overstuffing, right? Or a poor chewer. You don't want an open mouth posture at rest. Look at him in the back of the car. If a child is chronically drooling, they aren't swallowing. So that's infrequent, right? So those are symptoms that you want to say, okay, I have to up the ante. Let's buy some more chew toys. Let's do it together. Let's do some mirror work. Let's learn how to take turns, investigate with each other. If you see some of these symptoms, that suggests that there's possibly low sensory perception in the mouth, low tone, right? And so we want to then help them really improve through practice. And that's all it is. And one of the primary ways that we can do that is by teaching your baby and your toddler. So a 5, 6, 7, 8-month-old baby can easily learn how to drink through an open cup or to use a straw appropriately. And I'm excited to share with that in this next video here, because this is part of this masterpiece of those first 24 months. There's a lot going on, and it can feel overwhelming. I know, but no matter where you are on this journey, you can always reset the stage. You can always look and gather information, do some self-examination, make a new plan, right? Focus on one element at a time and ask yourself, is he really too fussy at bedtime, right? Or is he starting to be more and more of a picky eater? What else can I do? Or you could ask things like, is he really hard to soothe once he gets frustrated? What's their recovery time like, right? Are they really trying to use gestures and words together to communicate, to share, to be present with us? And do they really help enjoying being with you and try to do the everyday things that you're doing, like laundry and grocery shopping and sweeping and dusting and weeding and sorting the mail, cooking, cleaning, all of those wonderful daily activities that they should be eager to be a part of, right? So don't forget to download my packet, Learn to Self-Soothe, for you and your baby. Have a great week. Remember, eat, talk, and play. God bless. See you next week.